We will now begin today's presentation. If we could please move to slide number 2 of the presentation. We will first begin by introducing ourselves. I've already introduced myself a couple of times as the moderator of the session, but for those that may have missed it, my name is Dr. Nana Kwamina, and I'm the Director of the Environmental Assessment Division at the CNSC. I'm joined this afternoon by two of my colleagues, Nicole Frigo, Environmental Assessment Specialist, and Kevin Ross, Senior Project Officer. This slide shows the key messages of today's presentation. These are the main points we hope you remember when this webinar is finished. The CNSC's independent commission is the regulatory authority that will make decisions on CNL's proposed projects. CNSC staff conduct robust reviews and report their findings and documentation to inform the Commission's decisions. For each of CNL's proposals, CNSC staff will be submitting 2 documents to the Commission. One will be an environmental assessment report, which provides CNSC staff's assessments and conclusions on the environmental effects of the project in accordance with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012. And the other document will be CNSC staff's Licensing Commission Member Document, or CMD, which provides staff's technical assessment and conclusions on the licensing aspects of each proposal in accordance with the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. This includes staff's conclusions and recommendations on whether a license should be issued, and if so, under what conditions. The documents will be presented by CNSC staff during public commission hearings for each project. Information on how to participate in these hearings will be provided at the end of this webinar. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide a general overview of how CNSC staff will document our assessments with respect to the near surface disposal facility and in situ decommissioning projects, and how we will provide those assessments to the Commission for their decision. We'll end this webinar with a Q&A session for which we encourage you to submit your questions using the question and answer function in Zoom. Note that given technical assessments for these projects are still underway, CNSC staff are not in a position to discuss our findings or conclusions in this webinar. The scope today will be focused on the proposed format and structure of CNSC staff's documentation. It is our hope that this information will help participants navigate these documents once they are made available to the public for review. This slide situates us in terms of where we are in the webinar series that the CNSC has been hosting with respect to the Near Surface Disposal Facility, or NSDF, and the in situ decommissioning, which we'll refer to as the ISD projects from here on in. Today's session will not revisit the previous topics covered. However, if you were not aware of or unable to attend the previous webinars, we can certainly send you a copy of the presentations from those webinars, should you be interested in receiving those. Simply please email the webinar mailbox, which is the same as the one that was used to send you a copy of today's presentation. As you can see from this slide, we have been hosting a series of webinars related to these projects. The webinars are designed to present general information on the topics listed, followed by a dialogue and answering questions participants may have on the specific topic that is covered. Based on the feedback received during these webinars regarding which other topics participants are interested in hearing more about, we are planning another series of webinars related to these projects to take place in the fall. We will provide information on how to register for future webinars later in this presentation. Today's session will present an outline of specific documents created by CNSC staff as an outcome of the regulatory environmental assessment and licensing processes, namely the environmental assessment report and the licensing commission member document. We will begin with project updates on the NSDF and the 2 ISD projects. For this, I will turn the presentation over to Nicole Frigo.
Thank you, Nana, and welcome everyone. My name is Nicole Frigo, and I'm an environmental assessment specialist with the CNSC. First, an update on the NSDF project. CNL submitted a revised final environmental impact statement on May 28, 2021. The revised EIS is being reviewed by CNSC staff to determine if it addresses staff's feedback provided in January 2021 and which is available on the public registry. If the revised EIS is accepted, it will be posted to the CNSC website along with what we call the disposition tables, which contains CNL and CNSC staff responses to formal comments that were received on the draft EIS from the public, Indigenous groups, non-government organizations, and other stakeholders. The documents will be posted in both official languages. CNL is planning to submit a revised draft environmental impact statement and responses to federal and provincial review comments for each of the NPD and WR1 in situ decommissioning projects near the end of this summer and this upcoming fall, respectively. Upon passing completeness verification, the revised EIS and responses will undergo a technical review by the federal, provincial, and Indigenous review teams. Project updates can also be found in the feature articles that have been posted on the CNSC website. We'll now transition to the key topic of this webinar, starting with an overview of the CNSC regulatory review process. The proposed near-surface disposal facility and in situ decommissioning projects, which I will refer to as NSDF and ISD from here on in, are subject to the CNSC's regulatory review process, including a technical licensing assessment under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. As part of the CNSC's regulatory review, the CNSC conducts different types of environmental reviews depending on the laws and regulations that apply. The NSDF and ISD projects were determined to be designated projects under the former Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 2012. Although the Impact Assessment Act came into force in August 2019, projects with environmental assessments that were initiated under the former SIA 2012 continue under that process as enabled by provisions in the Impact Assessment Act. Environmental assessment and licensing processes can be conducted sequentially or in parallel, depending on which approach the proponent requests. For the NSDF and ISD projects, these two processes are being conducted in parallel. Although the review processes are being performed simultaneously, it's important to note that two technical reviews are occurring for these projects. The EA process includes participation from other federal and provincial authorities who contribute their expertise on topics related to their mandates. An example of this would be Health Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and Manitoba's Sustainable Development Department. And the licensing process includes technical review by CNSC staff on topics related to the CNSC's framework of 14 technical safety and control areas. To meet the legal requirements of both acts, the Commission will be responsible for making two separate decisions for each of these projects. First, they will determine if the project is likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects, taking into account any proposed mitigation measures. If it is not likely, the Commission will then make a licensing decision on each project. This next slide illustrates the CNSC's parallel regulatory process in a bit more detail. The licensing technical assessment is proceeding concurrently with the environmental assessment. Once the EA and licensing technical assessments are complete, CNSC staff recommendations are made to the Commission in public hearings in the form of an environmental assessment report and a licensing Commission member document, or EA and CMD. The Commission also hears from the licensee and interveners, which can include members of the public, environmental non-governmental organizations, and representatives of Indigenous communities. The Commission considers all of the evidence presented to them in making the EA and licensing decisions. Note that a project cannot proceed unless the Commission's decisions on both the EA and licensing are positive. The Commission must first render a decision on the EA under SIA 2012. Only if the Commission decides that the project is not likely to cause significant adverse environmental impacts will the Commission then make a decision on whether to license the project under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. If the Commission makes a positive EA decision and then issues a license, CNSC staff will undertake compliance verification and performance monitoring against the environmental assessment and license conditions approved by the Commission as part of its decisions. As this slide highlights, environmental monitoring occurs throughout the life cycle of the project. Additionally, the public and Indigenous peoples are involved at all stages of the regulatory review process. Moving on to specific documents created by the CNSC as an outcome of the regulatory process, we'll first talk about the Environmental Assessment Report, which documents the CNSC staff's assessment of the proponent's technical studies, known as the Environmental Impact Statement, that are submitted in relation to the project in accordance with SIA 2012. This slide simply shows the step where the EA report fits into the overall CNSC regulatory review process. Before getting into the EA report itself, this slide situates us on where the EA report fits into the CNSC's environmental assessment process. Specific to the NSDF and ISD projects, the first 3 steps of the process have already been completed or are ongoing. Steps 1 and 2 were completed in 2017 and are not part of today's webinar. We do note, however, that documents related to each of these steps can be found on CNSC's web pages for each of these projects. Step 3 is currently in progress. This has been captured in past webinars. December 2nd, 2020, we did a webinar on the NSDF and the nuclear power demonstration, and on April 7th, there was one done on the WR1 project. We also won't discuss steps 5 and 6 in today's presentation. The Commission hearing process will be the topic of a future webinar in the fall. And we presented a webinar on compliance verification on May 20th, 2021. So step 4 is the focus of today's webinar. The EA report is the summary of the technical assessment that verified the information presented by the proponent in the environmental impact statement and identified any potential adverse environmental effects that may be caused by the proposed project and associated activities. The EA report will detail staff's findings, including the identification of potential adverse environmental effects, any mitigation measures to mitigate those effects, the significance of the effects after taking into account mitigation measures, follow-up and monitoring to determine if effects are as predicted, and the effectiveness of the mitigation measures put into place. The report will summarize CNSC and CNL Indigenous consultation and engagement and describe how concerns from Indigenous groups and the public have been addressed by CNL, CNSC staff, and if applicable, other regulatory authorities. The report will also present an assessment of impacts of the project on Indigenous and/or treaty rights. Based on the analysis and conclusions in CNSC staff's EA report, recommended conditions will be included in the EA report for the Commission to consider in their decision. The recommended conditions outline proposed mitigation measures and follow-up program components that illustrate what the proponent should comply with in order to go forward with the proposed project. In general, the EA report will provide the Commission with a summary of CNSC staff's assessment, conclusions, and recommendations to the Commission on the EA for the designated project. The main inputs into the EA report include concerns raised by the public during public outreach activities and during formal comment periods, such as the project description and on the environmental impact statement, concerns expressed by Indigenous communities during consultation activities and, if submitted, during formal comment periods, federal provincial review team technical assessment of the environmental impact statement, and CNSC staff technical assessment of the proponent's EIS. It is important to note that each of these inputs, as expressed, are considered and inform CNSC staff's technical assessment, and that these views are reflected in the EA report. How these views will be documented in the EA report will be presented in a later slide. The EA report is structured to reflect the scope of the EA and address requirements of SIA 2012. Content of the EA report are generally outlined as follows. Introductory chapters, which describe the project, regulatory requirements, and the existing conditions in the project location. Predicted changes to the environment that could be caused by the project. Predicted effects on valued components from changes to the environment. Indigenous consultation and engagement and key issues raised during engagement and consultation activities, including Indigenous or treaty rights held by First Nations and Métis that could potentially be affected by the project. Public engagement and key issues raised during engagement activities, and conclusions, recommendations for follow-up measures and conditions. Predicted changes to the environment that could be caused by the project activities are presented in EA reports in terms of effects to the atmospheric, aquatic, terrestrial, geological, and hydrogeological, human, and socioeconomic environments. These subdivisions of the environment are referred to as environmental compartments. Changes to the environment can generally be understood as changes or effects to non-living components and a pathway between the project or activity and the valued component being affected. Changes to the environment caused by project activities can lead to effects on valued components. Valued components refer to features that may be affected by a project and that have been identified to be of concern by the proponent, government agencies, Indigenous groups, or the public. Generally speaking, effects in this category are effects on living organisms, including humans and human activity. Main categories include fish and fish habitat, migratory birds, terrestrial wildlife, species at risk, and human health. This also includes Indigenous current use of lands and resources such as hunting, trapping, fishing, harvesting, and the use of sites and areas of cultural or spiritual importance. For each valued component, CNSC staff assess whether there is potential effect due to the project activities. Mitigation measures are identified to eliminate, reduce, or control adverse environmental effects. A residual environmental effect is an environmental effect that remains or is predicted to remain after mitigation measures have been implemented. The determination of whether a project is likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects relates to the assessment of those residual environmental effects. In the EA report, a summary of each environmental compartment or valued component analyzed is provided, including identification of potential residual effects. For each of the identified potential residual effects of an environmental compartment or valued component, the proponent's assessment is summarized and the views of Indigenous groups and the public are presented, as well as those of other stakeholders. The proponent's information, as well as the public and Indigenous views, are both taken into consideration in CNSC staff's technical assessment of the residual effects and their significance and the drawing of conclusions and recommendations to the Commission. Through the formal comment periods in the NSDF and ISD projects that occurred in 2017, various public engagement methods and through consultation with Indigenous groups since the start of the project, the recurring concerns CNSC staff have heard include the following: long-term safety of the projects, proximity to an important water body, concern about possible groundwater contamination due to the projects, waste management and inventory questions, alignment of the projects with international standards, and lack of Indigenous traditional knowledge information. As per CNSC's EA process, all of the concerns heard and submitted through the formal comment periods are reviewed by CNSC and addressed by the relevant organization to whom the comments were intended. For example, either CNSC or CNL in these cases. Those response tables are posted online on the public registry at the time of posting the final EIS for for each project. As the EAN licensing regulatory processes for the NSDF and ISD projects have the potential to impact Indigenous and/or treaty rights, the duty to consult under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 was triggered. In order to demonstrate that the CNSC has fulfilled the duty to consult, the EA report presents a summary of all consultation conducted by the CNSC and CNL, any issues and concerns, as well as responses to those concerns. The EA report also contains information about the assessment of impacts of each project on Indigenous and/or treaty rights. For each of these projects, CNSC staff undertook collaborative rights impact assessments with some of the impacted Indigenous groups, and also encouraged Indigenous groups to provide their views with respect to the project's effects. I will now hand the presentation over to Kevin to discuss licensing commission member documents. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicole. My name is Kevin Ross, and I'm a project officer with the CNSC. This slide shows the step where the licensing review and documentation of findings into a licensing CMD fits into the overall CNSC regulatory process. CNSC staff's technical assessment is an integral part of the licensing regulatory review process. CNSC staff assess the licensee submissions and scrutinize the technical documents and safety assessments against legislative requirements. CNSC regulatory and guidance documents, CSA standards, as well as international guidance. Licensee submissions, including technical documentation, undergo as many rounds of review by CNSC staff as necessary in order to ensure that adequate supporting documents are provided, regulatory requirements are met, and staff expectations are fulfilled, and international and industry best practices are followed. CNSC staff determine whether the applicant is qualified and has made adequate provisions for the protection of the health and safety of people and the environment. A commission member document, or CMD, is a method by which CNSC staff document their technical assessment, conclusions, and regulatory recommendations to the commission regarding the license application made by the applicant for a proposal. The CMD captures the results of CNSC staff's assessment in all applicable 14 safety and control areas, and all information in the CMD is directly related to the license application. If CNSC staff recommend issuing a license, which comes only after an extensive iterative process between CNSC and the applicant during the technical assessment stage, then a proposed draft license and license condition handbook are included in the CMD package to the commission. The proposed license and handbook include the conditions and criteria that the licensee will need to meet in order to proceed with the project and carrying out the activities authorized under the license. The conclusions and recommendations in the licensing CMD are based on CNSC staff's technical assessment of all applicable safety and control areas related to the license application and related documentation, including the program submitted in support of an application, compliance and performance history, if the applicant is an existing licensee, and proposed improvements. In the case of the CNL projects, these reviews have been ongoing since 2016 and involved significant back and forth between CNSC and CNL. In the iterative licensing review process, CNSC staff examine CNL submissions and submit questions and comments derived from regulatory requirements, guidance, international best practices, and professional expertise. CNL must respond and revise their submissions as required in order to ensure adequate supporting documents are provided, regulatory requirements are met, and staff expectations are fulfilled. Environmental non-governmental organizations have expressed the concern that CMDs lack transparency on how the issues raised in CNSC staff's technical assessments are being handled and addressed. It is CNSC's goal to increase the transparency of this process and show within the CMD for significant technical areas what key components CNSC raised and how they are addressed by CNL. The licensing CMD is based on CNSC's Safety and Control Area Framework and reflects the requirements of the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. Licensing CMD typically consists of the following sections: a general overview, which generally describes the project, the regulatory requirements, and the regulatory review process that was carried out for the proposal, the matters for the Commission's consideration, CNSC staff's technical assessment and evaluation of the specific proposal, CNSC staff's overall assessment of the safety and control areas, any other matters for the Commission's attention, CNSC staff's overall conclusions and recommendations, and appendices. We will give a general breakdown of the sections of the CMD in the next slides. As mentioned, CNSC technical assessments are anchored in our framework of 14 safety and control areas, or SCAs, listed on the right hand of this slide. The SCA framework is designed to allow CNSC staff to evaluate all applications consistently and provide a platform to ensure that all aspects relevant to safety and security are thoroughly reviewed using a risk-informed approach. The results of technical assessments are CNSC staff's technical conclusions and recommendations that are considered in conjunction with the regulatory information to make overall regulatory recommendations to the Commission in the licensing CMD. The main assessments in the licensing CMD are documented in the Assessment of Safety and Control Areas section, and a summary of the project's main phases are summarized in the Project Evaluation section. The Project Evaluation section will provide a summary of information on the review of the site selection, design of the facility, the construction and operation and closure of the facility, and the long-term safety and performance of the facility after closure. This section also provides a summary on the review of the facility's safety case, which represents the collection of evidence demonstrating the facility is safe and that there are no unreasonable risks. The details are provided in the assessment of the safety and control areas in section 4. The Assessment of Safety and Control Areas section will depict CNSC staff's thorough review of the application for 14 SCAs and associated aspects relevant to the safety of the facility during its entire life cycle. This section will include, for each SCA, the relevant applicable NSCA regulatory requirements, staff review, conclusions, and recommendations. The appendices to the CMD will include the EA report, a proposed license, and an associated or amended license condition handbook will also be appended to the CMD. The proposed license and associated handbook will include proposed facility-specific conditions that staff recommend the Commission to consider in making its decisions. In addition, there may be other appendices included to facilitate the presentation of key or supplemental information, such as mapping of the elements of a license application to CNSC's regulatory requirements. The Matters for Consideration section will provide context to the Commission for the items being presented in the CMD. This includes documenting the regulatory and technical basis that are the foundation for CNSC staff's assessment of the project, indicating which of the CNSC's 14 safety and control areas are relevant to the assessment, and providing general information on the environmental assessment requirements applicable to the project. The EA report appended to the CMD will provide the details for the environmental assessment. The Other Matters of Regulatory Interest section will provide information to the Commission on items not directly considered within the 14 technical safety and control areas. These can include other requirements such as consultation with Indigenous groups and the public, financial guarantees, and nuclear liability insurance. I will now turn the presentation back to Nana.
We will now outline how to participate in future Commission hearings and provide information on how you can learn more about our upcoming webinar series. As we've outlined throughout this presentation, the CNSC's Independent Commission is a regulatory authority that will make 2 decisions on the CNL's proposed projects, one on the environmental assessment and one on the license application. To help inform the Commission, CNSC staff will present their assessment, conclusions, and recommendations for these 2 decisions in the licensing CMD and appended EA report. The Commission must determine if the project is likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects, taking into account any proposed mitigation measures. If it is not likely, the Commission will then make a licensing decision on the project. Interveners will have the opportunity to review CNSC staff's documentation in advance of the public hearings to help inform their interventions. We encourage you to express your views by intervening in the public hearing process. The Commission considers all evidence and information presented during public proceedings. As detailed further on the next slide, anyone can request to formally participate in public hearings as interveners. Members of the public, Indigenous groups, and other stakeholders can formally participate as interveners in public hearings. The CNSC provides project-specific funding through its participant funding program to support the public, Indigenous groups, and other stakeholders to participate in these proceedings. Participant funding was made available at multiple stages of the regulatory review process, including for participation in the public hearings for the near surface disposal facility project, as well as the in situ decommissioning projects. To learn more about the CNSC's participant funding program, please visit the link shown at the bottom of this slide. As previously mentioned, we are planning another series of webinars in the fall on the near surface disposal facility and the nuclear power demonstration closure project, as well as the White Shell Reactor 1 in situ decommissioning projects. Invitations to these webinars will be sent to the CNSC subscriber list and the respective project distribution lists. Registration will also be available through the CNSC main webpage and the registration link on the slide. So we really hope to see you all there. We hope today's session provided a useful outline of the specific documents created by the CNSC as an outcome of the regulatory environmental assessment and licensing processes, namely the environmental assessment report and the licensing commission member document.